The harbor in Baltimore was never silent, but the sounds were soft ones. On a February morning in 1895, the mist rose from the Patapsco River and curled around the brick buildings on Emory Street. The neighborhood was a working waterfront, full of fish markets, saloons, and the smell of wet wood. In a small row house, a boy named George Herman Ruth came into the world. His parents, Kate and George Sr., ran a tavern where longshoremen gathered after their shifts. The light that entered their upstairs window was thin and gray, filtered through the smoke of a bustling port city. The baby slept in a simple wooden cradle, unaware that his name would one day echo through stadiums full of sunlight and cheering people. But that was still decades away, and the world outside the nursery remained wrapped in the quiet rhythms of the tide. The streets around the Ruth home were narrow and alive. Children ran along the cobblestones, their voices mixing with the calls of street vendors. Young George learned to walk on these uneven stones, holding his mother's hand as she navigated the crowded sidewalks. He was a sturdy child, with round cheeks and curious eyes that watched the ships coming in from the Chesapeake Bay. His father worked long hours in the tavern, and his mother was often unwell. The boy spent many afternoons sitting on the front steps, drawing circles in the dust with a stick, listening to the slap of water against the piers. There was a loneliness to those hours, but also a kind of peace. The sun would move slowly across the brick facades, painting them orange and rose as evening approached. It was a world of simple textures: rough stone, weathered wood, the salt crust on iron railings. By the time he turned 7, the rhythms of the waterfront had become a part of him. He knew the names of the fishing boats and the smell of steaming crabs seasoned with Old Bay. But life inside the saloon was less kind. The tavern was a noisy, smoky place where arguments could flare like struck matches. His parents, worn down by work and illness, struggled to keep him on a straight path. The boy began running with a gang of street kids who stole fruit from market stalls and threw rocks at passing trolley cars. There was no malice in it, only restlessness and a need to fill the empty hours. One summer afternoon, a parish priest saw George in an alley, scuffling with another boy over a discarded baseball. It was a ball made of rags and twine, its cover long gone. The priest knelt down, his black cassock absorbing the heat, and spoke softly to the child. Something in that conversation shifted the course of a life. St. Mary's Industrial School stood on a hill beyond the row houses, a large stone building with tall windows that caught the morning light. It was a refuge for boys who needed structure and care. When George was sent there shortly after his 7th birthday, he walked through iron gates into a world of dormitories, workshops, and wide playing fields. The Xaverian brothers who ran the school believed in order, in the healing power of routine. Every morning began with the soft chime of a bell and the shuffle of feet on polished wooden floors. The boys learned trades: carpentry, tailoring, printing. The scent of sawdust and ink filled the air. For the first time, George had a bed of his own, a schedule, and adults who spoke to him with patience. The windows in the dormitory looked out over green lawns that sloped down to a grove of oak trees. In the distance, you could see the smokestacks of the city, but here there was quiet. It was on the school's baseball diamond that George found his true home. The field was a patch of trimmed grass bordered by a low wooden fence. Beyond right field, a stream ran lazily, catching the reflection of clouds. Brother Matthias, a towering man with a gentle voice, was the boys' first real coach. He taught George how to grip a bat, how to watch the ball leave the pitcher's hand, how to shift his weight and swing with a smooth, level arc. The crack of the bat against the ball became the music of the boys' days. He would stay out on the field long after the other boys had gone to supper, the sun slipping behind the oaks, the air cooling around him. Brother Matthias would stand at the fence, rolling ball after ball to the plate, never tiring of the ritual. In those soft twilight sessions, the foundation of a legend was laid, not with fanfare, but with the steady repetition of a boy and a ball and a patient man. Inside the school, life was simple and measured. Meals were eaten in a long hall with high ceilings and arched windows. The boys sat at wooden tables, the clink of forks the only sound until grace was said. George learned to tailor shirts, stitching seams with careful precision. He worked in the print shop, his fingers stained with ink, setting type for small prayer cards. These tasks taught him patience, a quality that would stay with him long after he left the stone walls of St. Mary's. At night, the dormitory was lit by a single gas lamp near the door. The boys lay in rows of iron beds, the sheets cool against their skin. Through the window, George could see the stars over the Chesapeake. He would fall asleep thinking of the white ball arcing through the blue sky, the satisfying thud of it landing in the tall grass beyond the outfield. The years passed gently within those walls. George grew taller and broader, his hands becoming strong from swinging the bat and gripping the tailor's shears. By the time he was 14, his name was known throughout the school, not for mischief, but for the way he could hit a baseball. The other boys would gather along the fence to watch him practice, their quiet murmur a soft chorus of admiration. Brother Matthias would smile from the sidelines, knowing that he had helped shape something remarkable. The afternoons on the field were bathed in a golden light that seemed to separate that patch of earth from the rest of the world. The roar of the city faded away, replaced by the hum of insects and the occasional cry of a gull. It was a sanctuary, and within it, a boy was becoming something more. The day eventually came when a scout from the Baltimore Orioles visited St. Mary's. He stood at the edge of the diamond, a quiet man in a linen suit, squinting against the sun. George took his position at the plate, gripped the bat, and waited. The pitcher wound up, the ball came in low and fast, and the sound of the hit echoed across the field like a bell ringing in a still church. The scout watched the ball sail over the fence, disappear into the stream beyond, and he simply nodded. The wheels of a new life began to turn, but in that moment, on that field, there was only the afternoon heat, the smell of fresh-cut grass, and the slow, contented walk of a boy returning to the bench. The sun was setting behind the oak trees, and the world was still full of promise. Fenway Park rose from the streets of Boston like a cathedral built for sunshine and grass. When George Ruth first walked through its gates in 1914, he was not yet the legend he would become. He was a young pitcher with long arms and a face that still held the roundness of boyhood. The stadium was new then, its wooden seats smelling of fresh varnish, its green walls still glowing with the first coat of paint. The morning light fell in long, slanted panels across the infield, and the outfield grass was so green it seemed to hum with its own quiet energy. He stood on the mound, his cleats pressing into the soft dirt, and looked up at the empty stands. The silence of an empty ballpark is a special thing, a kind of held breath waiting for the crowds to fill it. But on that morning, the only sound was the wind moving through the grandstand and the distant clatter of a streetcar on Brookline Avenue. The days in Boston had a gentle rhythm. Ruth lived in a small boarding house not far from the ballpark, a white clapboard building with a garden of hydrangeas in the front yard. He would wake early, the sun not yet over the harbor, and walk the quiet streets to the field. The neighborhood was a mix of brick shops and wooden houses, with elm trees lining the sidewalks. Shopkeepers would raise their blinds as he passed, casting rectangles of warm light onto the pavement. The air smelled of bread from the bakery and salt from the sea. He moved through these mornings without hurry, a tall, silent figure in a rumpled coat, his baseball glove tucked under his arm like a favorite book. The routine was simple: a cup of coffee at the corner diner, the walk, the arrival at the player's entrance where the guard would nod and let him through. It was a life built on small, comforting patterns. Inside Fenway Park, the world expanded into a realm of green geometry. Ruth spent hours on the field before the other players arrived, sometimes pitching to an empty batter's box, his motion fluid and unhurried. The ball left his hand cleanly, spinning through the cool air before smacking into the catcher's mitt with a sound like a fist hitting a pillow. The infield dirt was raked in perfect concentric patterns, and the white chalk lines looked sharp as cut paper against the grass. He would stand in center field and look back at the wooden wall that would later be called the Green Monster. It seemed impossibly tall, a sheer wall that rose 40 feet above the field, covered in advertisements for life insurance and shaving cream. But to him, it was not an obstacle, it was a landmark, a friendly giant that guarded left field. In the early light, Its green surface had the soft sheen of moss. As a pitcher, Ruth had a remarkable season in 1916, winning 23 games and leading the league in earned run average. But even then, his hitting drew attention. There was something different about the way he swung the bat. It was not a violent motion, but a smooth, full-bodied turn, like a door opening on well-oiled hinges. The ball would leap off his bat and climb into the sky, a white dot against the blue, before vanishing into the center field bleachers. The fans began to come early just to watch batting practice. They would sit in the shade of the grandstand roof, programs fanning the warm afternoon air, and murmur with delight as ball after ball sailed into the seats. For Ruth, those moments were not about power, but about timing. He described it later as a feeling of stillness at the center of everything, the world slowing down until the only thing that existed was the white sphere and the arc of his swing. The 1918 World Series brought a different kind of quiet to Fenway. The country was in the grip of the Great War, and the crowds were smaller, their cheers more subdued. Ruth pitched in Game 1, a complete game shutout against the Chicago Cubs. The afternoon sun was pale, a thin layer of clouds diffusing the light over the field. The sounds of the game were crisp and clear, the crack of the bat, the pop of the glove, the umpire's call. There was a gentle melancholy in the air, a sense that everyone was holding something back. Ruth stood on the mound, his face expressionless, working through the innings with mechanical grace. Between pitches, he would look out at the flag fluttering in center field, its stars and stripes a reminder of distant trenches. The victory, when it came, was met not with a roar but with a deep, collective exhale, as if the city had been waiting for permission to smile. Off the field, life in Boston was a quiet affair. Ruth would sometimes walk down to the Charles River in the evening, watching the rowers glide past in their slender shells. The water was smooth as dark silk, reflecting the lights of the bridges. He would stand on the Harvard Bridge, hands in his pockets, and let the cooling air wash over him. The city's sounds were muted here, a distant bell, the hum of a motor car, the gentle lapping of water against the stones. He was still a young man, still learning the contours of his own life. The fame had not yet become the overwhelming thing it would be. He could still pass through the streets largely unrecognized, a tall figure in a flat cap, nodding to the lamplighters as they made their evening rounds. The sky would turn from peach to lavender to deep indigo, and the first stars would appear above the golden dome of the State House. The transition from pitcher to full-time hitter happened gradually, like the changing of the seasons. By 1919, he was playing more games in left field, his pitching duties lessening. The outfield grass at Fenway was his new domain, a sprawling green carpet where he could stretch his legs and chase fly balls with the joy of a boy let out of school. The sun would warm the back of his neck as he stood with his hands on his knees, waiting for the pitch. The wall loomed behind him, casting a long shadow over the infield as the day progressed. There was a rhythm to standing in the outfield, a meditative quality to the long stretches between action. He could hear the vendors calling out peanuts and scorecards, the low murmur of the crowd, the sharp strike of the ball against the bat. It was a kind of music, and he was a part of it, a quiet note in a vast, green symphony. The news of his sale to the New York Yankees came in the winter of 1919, as snow fell softly on the streets of Boston. Ruth was in California at the time, hearing the news through a telegram that crackled with static and surprise. The reporters called it a tragedy for Boston, but for Ruth, it was simply the next chapter. He packed his bags in the boarding house, his room suddenly full of shadows and half-empty drawers. He looked out the window at the familiar street, the elm trees bare now, their branches etched against a gray sky. The hydrangeas in the garden were dormant, waiting for the spring that would come without him. He left the key on the kitchen table and walked out into the cold, the collar of his coat turned up against the wind. The trolley carried him past Fenway Park, its dark windows staring back at him like empty eyes. He did not look away. Some part of him would always belong to the city, to these streets, to the green wall and the quiet river. But the road ahead was calling, and the light of New York was already beginning to glow on the horizon. New York in the 1920s was a city of vertical dreams. Skyscrapers pushed upward into the hazy sky, their windows catching the morning light like sheets of gold. When Babe Ruth arrived, the city was already humming with the energy of a new decade, but it had not yet found its true voice. The Polo Grounds, where the Yankees played, sat beneath Coogan's Bluff, a horseshoe-shaped stadium filled with shadows and echoes. Ruth walked into that stadium, looked at the short right field porch, and quietly began to change everything. The crowds came first in curiosity, then in devotion, their numbers swelling until the old wooden stands groaned with the weight of them. The air around the ballpark buzzed with anticipation even on days when the gates were still closed. The sound of his bat striking a ball could be heard blocks away, a sharp, clean note that drew people like a bell calling them to worship. The Polo Grounds had a peculiar charm. The outfield walls were irregular, the stands overhung the field, and the smell of cigar smoke mixed with the aroma of roasted peanuts. Ruth would stand in right field, his massive shoulders casting a broad shadow, and watch the game unfold with a patient eye. Between innings, he would toss a ball with a young boy in the front row, the gesture as natural as breathing. The afternoon sun would filter through the grandstand pillars, creating stripes of light and shade across the grass. That light had a soft, golden quality, as if the era itself were being preserved in amber. The crowds were different now, too. They were louder, more electric, but they also held a kind of collective stillness in the moments before his swing. When Ruth stepped to the plate, the noise would recede like a tide, replaced by a hushed expectancy that seemed almost sacred. In 1923, a new cathedral rose from the soil of the Bronx. Yankee Stadium was a monument of steel and concrete, its triple-decked grandstand sweeping around the field in a great gray crescent. The architects had designed it with Ruth in mind. The right field fence was tucked in close, a mere 295 feet from home plate, an invitation to his left-handed power. On opening day, he christened the park with a home run, and the building became known forever as the house that Ruth built. Walking into that stadium for the first time, you felt as though you were entering a vast, open-air church. The grass was a perfect emerald rectangle, the base paths neatly combed, the white lines crisp against the earth. The grandstand cast a deep shadow over the infield, a cool refuge from the bright New York afternoon. The light in the Bronx had a clarity to it, a sharpness that made everything look like a photograph in a Sunday magazine. Ruth's daily routines were simple and steady. He lived in a hotel suite near Times Square, a spacious apartment with velvet curtains and a phonograph that played Enrico Caruso records. In the mornings, he would walk down Broadway, past the theaters and the automats, the shoeshine stands, and the flower carts. The city was a tapestry of smells: fresh coffee, hot asphalt, the perfume of women in cloche hats. He was recognized, of course. Children would tug at their mother's sleeves, men would tip their fedoras, but he moved through the crowds with a gentle, unhurried stride. He often stopped at a diner on West 45th Street, where he would eat a breakfast of steak and eggs, his fork moving slowly, his gaze distant. The waiters knew to leave him be until he had finished his coffee. There was a peace in these quiet rituals, a buffer against the noise of fame. The ballpark itself had its own daily rituals. Hours before game time, the groundskeepers would water the infield, the spray forming tiny rainbows in the sun. The peanut vendors would stack their bags in neat pyramids, and the ushers would dust off the wooden seats with soft cloths. Ruth would arrive early, as he had in Boston, and sit in the dugout, looking out at the expanse of green. He would lace his cleats slowly, his thick fingers working the white cords, his mind already seeing the flight of the ball. He would take batting practice, and the early arriving fans would watch in silence, their faces upturned like flowers toward the sun. The sound of his bat connecting with the ball was different in this stadium, a deeper, rounder sound that reverberated off the concrete walls. The ball would arc high into the stands, a white speck disappearing into the sea of empty seats, and then fall with a soft thud. The seasons in New York were intense, each one a vivid chapter. In spring, the newly painted seats gleamed under a tender sun, and the ivy on the outfield walls began to show the first green of the year. The crowds would arrive in light coats and straw hats, their cheeks flushed with the mild air. In summer, The heat pressed down on the city, and the games moved with a languid pace. Vendors circulated with trays of lemonade and ice cream, their cries a rhythmic counterpoint to the play on the field. Ruth would stand in the outfield, sweat darkening the back of his jersey, and watch the clouds drift over the Manhattan skyline. The afternoons were long and golden, stretching into early evening as the sun set behind the third base grandstand, painting the sky in shades of apricot and rose. The shadows grew longer, the air cooled slightly, and the arc lights flickered on with a quiet hum. The year 1927 remains a landmark in the quiet history of baseball. That summer, Ruth hit 60 home runs, a number that seemed as impossible as a fairy tale. But the season itself was not a loud, brash affair. It was a slow accumulation of moments, each one a small masterpiece of timing and grace. Game after game, he would step to the plate, his face calm, his eyes on the pitcher. The swing was the same every time, a smooth pivot, a flash of the bat, and then the slow, majestic flight of the ball. The fans would rise as one, a silent wave of white shirts and straw hats, watching the ball disappear into the stands. Then, and only then, would the cheer come, a deep, earth-shaking sound that rolled through the Bronx. But for Ruth, the moment that mattered was the one in between, the fraction of a second when the bat met the ball and the world held its breath. Away from the field, Ruth found solace in simple pleasures. He had a farm in Massachusetts where he would retreat during the off-season, a place of rolling hills and stone walls, of quiet mornings and the smell of wood smoke. He would walk the fields in heavy boots, a hunting dog at his heels, his face turned to the pale winter sky. The farmhouse was a sturdy colonial with a wide porch and a fireplace that crackled with oak logs. He would sit in a rocking chair, a blanket over his knees, and read the newspapers by lamplight. The headlines often carried his name, but here, surrounded by the silence of the countryside, the words seemed to belong to someone else. The snow would fall softly on the roof, muting the world, and the fire would cast dancing shadows on the walls. In these moments, the great Babe Ruth was simply George again, a man at peace in the stillness of his own land.